meetings been seeing the effects of those moves. Why did the committee feel it was necessary to keep moving?
Well, my question is why. The reason is that we, again, with our monetary policy, we're trying to reach and then stay at for an extended period level of policy stance that's sufficiently restrictive to bring inflation down to 2% over time. And that's what we're trying to do with our tool. I think slowing down was the right move. I think it's enabled us to see more data, and it will continue to do so. We really, we have to balance. We always have to balance the risk of not doing enough and not getting inflation under control against the risk of maybe slowing down economic activity too much. And we thought that this rate hike, along with the meaningful change in our policy statement, was the right way to balance that.
And just to follow up, what you said in response to Howard's question, you'll need data to accumulate to determine if this is a sufficiently restrictive stance. Does that data need to accumulate, or could it accumulate over a longer period than a 6-week intermeeting cycle?
As I mentioned, I would just say that this assessment will be an ongoing one. You can't with economic data. You can't. You've seen take inflation from it. Look back. We've seen inflation come down, move back up 2 or 3 times since March of 2021. We've seen inflation have a few months of coming down and then come right back up. So I think you're going to want to see that, that a few months of data will persuade you that you've got this right, kind of thing. And we have the luxury. We've raised 500 basis points. I think that policy is tight. I think real rates are probably, you can calculate them many different ways, but one way is to look at the nominal rate and then subtract a reasonable estimate of let's say 1-year inflation, which might be 3%. So you've got 2% real rates. That's meaningfully above what many people anyway, would assess as the neutral rate. So policy is tight, and you see that in interest-sensitive activities, and you also begin to see it more and more in other activities. And if you put the credit tightening on top of that and the QT that's ongoing, I think you feel like we may not be far off. We're possibly even at that level.
Thank you very much, Chair Powell. Edward Lawrence with Fox Business. So if the Federal Reserve gets down to the 3% inflation as the projections show at the end of this year, or close to it, would it be okay for you for a prolonged period of 3% inflation and hoping for some outside event to move down to 2% target?
I think we're always going to have 2% as our target. We're always going to be focusing on getting there.
But would you be okay with a prolonged 3%?
Let me just say that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for inflation going down to 2% over time. That's not a question that's in front of us, and it would depend on so many other things. But ultimately, we're not looking to get to 3% and then drop our tools. We have a goal of getting to 2%. We think it's going to take some time. We don't think it'll be a smooth process, I think we're going to need to stay at this for a while.
How does the other side of the mandate, the jobs side, once you get to 3%, going from 3 to 2, how does the other side of the mandate balance?
I think they will both matter equally at that point. Right now, you have a labor market that's still extraordinarily tight. You still got 1.6 job openings, even with the lower job openings number, for every unemployed person. We do see some evidence of softening in labor market conditions, but overall, you're near a 50-year low in unemployment. Wages, you all will have seen the wage number from late last week, and it's whenever it was, and it's a couple percentage points above what would be consistent with 2% inflation over time. So we do see some softening. We see new labor supply coming in. These are very positive developments, but the labor market is very, very strong. Whereas inflation is running high, well above our goal, and right now we need to be focusing on bringing inflation down. Fortunately, we've been able to do that so far without unemployment going up.
Hi, Chair Powell. Matthew Boso with Bloomberg News. So many analysts noted at the time of the March FOMC meeting that at least half of Fed officials' projections did imply or seem to imply that a recession was in their baseline forecast as well, given the strong first quarter GDP tracking estimates. And so I'm just wondering if you could kind of elaborate on, why you're optimistic that a recession can be avoided, given that that's the Fed staff's forecast, possibly also the broader committee's forecast as well, and also, of course, most private sector forecasters.
Yeah, I don't think, I know what's printed in the Summary of Economic Projections and all that. I don't think you can deduce exactly what you said about what participants think, because you don't know what they were thinking for first quarter GDP at that point. They could have been thinking about a fairly low number. Anyway, in any case, I'll just say I continue to think that it's possible that this time is really different. And the reason is there's just so much excess demand, really, in the labor market. It's interesting, we've raised rates by 5 percentage points in 14 months, and the unemployment rate is 3.5%, pretty much where it was, even lower than where it was when we started. So job openings are still very, very high. We see by surveys and much evidence that conditions are cooling gradually, but it really is different. It wasn't supposed to be possible for job openings to decline by as much as they've declined without unemployment going up. Well, that's what we've seen. So there are no promises in this, but it just seems that to me that it's possible that we can continue to have a cooling in the labor market without having the big increases in unemployment that have gone with many, prior episodes. Now, that would be against history. I fully appreciate that. That would be against the pattern. But I do think that the situation in the labor market with so much excess demand, yet wages have been moving down. Wage increases have been moving down, and that's a good sign, down to more sustainable levels. So I think it's still possible. I think the case of avoiding a recession is, in my view, more likely than that of having a recession. But it's not that the case of having a recession is. I don't rule that out either. It's possible that we will have what I hope would be a mild recession.
The committee also noted in March that wage growth was still well above levels that would be consistent with 2% inflation. Do you see that as well? And could you kind of explain, how you come to that judgment?
Sure. So we look at a range of wage measures, and then that's a nominal, and then so you assume wages should be equal to productivity increases plus inflation. And so you can look at the Employment Compensation Index, average hourly earnings, the Atlanta Wage Tracker, compensation per hour, basically those four and many others, and you can look at what they would have to run at over a long period of time for that to be consistent with 2% inflation. They can deviate. Corporate margins can go up and down, and there is a feature of long expansions where they do go down, where labor gets a bigger share toward later in a recession. Later in expansion. So yeah, and we calculate those, and you have to take the precision with a degree of salt. But I would say that what they will show is that if wages are running at 5%, 3% is closer to where they need to be. Wage increases closer to 3%, roughly, is what it would take to be consistent with inflation over a longer period of time. By the way, I do not think that wages are the principal driver of inflation. You're asking me a very specific question. I think there are many things. I think wages and prices tend to move together, and it's very hard to say what's causing what. But I've never said that wages are really the principal driver, because I don't think that's really right.
Great. Chris Rugaber at Associated Press. Well, you mentioned profit margins. Those have did expand sharply during this inflationary period. And while there are some signs that they are starting to decline, many economists note they haven't fallen as much as might be expected, given that we're seeing at least some pullback among consumer spending. So, speaking of causes of inflation, do you see expanded profit margins as a driver of higher prices? And if so, would you expect them to narrow soon and contribute to reduced inflation in the coming months?
So higher profits and higher margins are what happens when you have an imbalance between supply and demand. Too much demand, not enough supply. And we've been in a situation in many parts of the economy where supply has been fixed or not flexible enough. And so, the way the market clears is through higher prices. So I think as goods pipelines have gotten, back to normal so that we don't have the long waits and the shortages and that kind of thing, I think you will see inflation come down, and you'll see corporate margins coming down as a result of a return of full competition where there's enough supply to meet demand, and then you're really back to full competition. That would be the dynamic I would expect.
Michael McKee from Bloomberg Radio and Television. Can you tell us something about what your policy reaction function is, your policy framework is going forward? When you look at the economy at the next meeting, are you looking at incoming data, which is by definition backward looking? Are you going to be forecasting what you think is going to happen? Are you ruling out the rate cuts that the market has priced in?
Didn't catch the last part. Ruling.
Markets have priced in rate cuts by the end of the year. Do you
Sorry.
rule that out?
Okay, I got it. So what are we looking at? I mean, we look at a combination of data and forecasts. Of course, the whole idea is to create a good forecast based on what you see in the data. So we're always looking at both, and it'll be the obvious things. It'll be readings on inflation. It'll be readings on wages, on economic growth, on the labor market, and all of those many things. I think a particular focus for us going now over the past 6-7 weeks now, and going forward is going to be what's happening with credit tightening. Are small and medium-sized banks tightening credit standards, and is that having an effect on loans, on lending? And so we can begin to assess how that fits in with monetary policy. That'll be an important thing. We'll be looking at everything. It's, again, I would just point out, we've raised rates by 5 percentage points. We are shrinking the balance sheet, and now we have credit conditions tightening, not just in the normal way, but perhaps a little bit more due to what's happened. And we have to factor all of that in and make our assessment of whether our policy stance is sufficiently restrictive. And we have to do that in a world where policy works with long and variable lags. So this is challenging, but we will make our best assessment, and that's what we think.
What about the idea of rate cuts?
Yeah, so we on the committee have a view that inflation is going to come down, not so quickly, but it'll take some time. And in that world, if that forecast is broadly right, it would not be appropriate to cut rates, and we won't cut rates. If you have a different forecast, then markets have been from time to time pricing in quite rapid reductions in inflation. We factor that in, but that's not our forecast. And of course, the history of the last 2 years has been very much that inflation moves down. Particularly now, if you look at non-housing services, it really hasn't moved much, and it's quite stable. And so we think demand will have to weaken a little bit, and labor market conditions may have to soften a bit more to begin to see progress there. And again, in that world, it wouldn't be appropriate for us to cut rates.
Courtney Brown from Axios. I'm curious how you view the role of the overnight reverse repo facility in the context of the current banking stress. Do you think it's contributing to the stress by making it more attractive for money market funds to compete with banks for deposits? And did the committee discuss any changes to the structure of the facility? Or do you see that being put on the table in the future? Thanks.
Sure. So we looked at that very carefully, as you would imagine, and it's really not contributing. We don't think now. It hasn't actually been growing. It moved up, moved down, and then moved back up to where it was. What happened in the when there were the big deposit flows, which by the way have really stabilized now. What happened was institutional investors took their uninsured deposits and put them in government money market funds, which bought paper from the Federal Home Loan Banks and things like that. Over the course of of maybe the last year, retail investors had been gradually, as they do in every tightening cycle, they've been gradually moving their deposits into higher yielding places such as CDs and other things, including money market funds. So that's a gradual process that is quite natural and happens during a tightening cycle. What was unusual really was the institutional investors moving their uninsured deposits and spreading them around, things like that. But it doesn't seem to have had any effect overall on the overnight repo facility. That is really there to help us keep rates where they're supposed to be, and it's serving that purpose very well.
Sarah Ewald Weiss, CBS News. I want to go back to the debt ceiling for a moment. I know you talked about that in terms of fiscal policy, but can you just speak towards what the impact of a default would mean for Americans across the country, the markets, and borrowing?
Yeah, I would just say it's. I don't really think we should be. We shouldn't even be talking about a world in which the U.S. doesn't pay its bills. It just shouldn't be a thing. And again, I would just say we don't. No one should assume that the Fed can really protect the economy and the financial system and our reputation globally from the damage that such an event might inflict.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Scott Horsley from NPR. In his report last week, Vice Chair Barr identified a couple of the factors that he thought contributed to the regulatory, the supervisory lapses at Silicon Valley Bank. Policy change in 2019 to exempt all but the biggest banks from strict scrutiny, and also what he called a sort of cultural shift towards less aggressive oversight. You were here in 2019. Do you share that view, and what would it take to get the stronger oversight that you and he said in your release would be necessary?
So I didn't take part in creating the report or doing the work, but I have read it, of course, and I find it persuasive. I mean, I would say it this way: a large bank, not a very large bank, a large bank failed quite suddenly and unexpectedly in a way that threatened to spread contagion into the financial system. I think the only thing that I'm really focused on is to understand what went wrong, what happened, and identify what we need to do to address that. Some of that it may just have been technology evolving. We have to keep up with all that, but some of it may be our policies and supervisory and regulatory, whatever. What our job is now is identify those things and implement them, and that's kind of the only thing I care about is. And I feel like I am accountable for doing everything I can to make sure that happens.
Thank you. Evan Reiser with MNI Market News. Chair Powell, are we in the early stage or nearing the end stage of the banking turmoil among regional banks? And secondly, do you still have a bias to tighten rates? Is that what the statement is saying?
So, I guess I would say it this way. There were three large banks, really, from the very beginning, that were at the heart of the stress that we saw in early March, the severe period of stress. Those have now all been resolved, and all the depositors have been protected. I think that the resolution and sale of First Republic kind of draws a line under that period is an important step toward drawing a line under that period of severe stress. Okay. I also think we are very focused on what's happening with credit availability, particularly with what you saw in the beige book, and you will see in the SLOOS is small and medium-sized banks who are feeling that they need to tighten credit standards, build liquidity. What's going to be the macroeconomic effect of that? More broadly, we will continue to very carefully monitor what's going on in the banking system, and we'll factor that assessment into our decisions in an important way going forward.
Thank you, Fed Chairman. Greg Robb from Market Watch. I just wondered if you've done any reflection on on your own actions during this crisis and leading up to it over the last, since you've been Fed Chairman, I think I've heard you say a couple of times that you deferred to the Vice Chair for supervision. Do you think that was the right way to go about this? And, yeah, comments on that. Thank you.
Sure. So let me say, first of all, I've been chair of the board for 5+ years now, and I fully recognize that we made mistakes. I think we've learned some new things as well, and we need to do better. And as I mentioned, I thought the report was unflinching and appropriately so. I welcome it, and I agree with and will support those recommendations. And I do feel that I'm personally accountable to do what I can to foster measures that will address the problems. So on the Vice Chair for supervision, the place to start is the statutory role, which is quite unusual. The Vice Chair, it says, shall develop policy recommendations for the board regarding supervision and regulation of depository institution companies, and shall oversee the supervision and regulation of such firms. So this is Congress establishing a 4-year term for someone else on the board, not the chair, as Vice Chair for supervision, who really gets to set the agenda for supervision and regulation for the Board of Governors. Congress wanted that person to have political accountability for developing that agenda. So the way it works, the way it has worked in practice for me is I've had a good working relationship. I give my counsel my input privately, and I offer that, and I have good conversations, and I try to contribute constructively. I respect the authority that Congress has deferred on that person, including working with Vice Chair Barr and his predecessor. And I think that's the way it's supposed to work, and that's appropriate. I believe that's what the law requires, and but it isn't. I wouldn't say it's a matter of complete deference. It's more. I have a role in presenting my views and having an intelligent discussion about what's going on and why, and that's my input. But ultimately, that person does get to set the agenda and gets to take things to the Board of Governors, and really in supervision has sole authority over supervision.
Just wondered if you had any regrets, or was there anything that, decisions that maybe you regret now in light of what's happened?
I've had a few. Sure. I mean, who doesn't look back and think that you could have done things differently? But honestly, you don't get to do that. Again, my focus is on what you control the controllable. As one of my great mentors used to always say, control the controllable. What we control now is make a fair assessment, learn the right lessons, figure out what the fixes are, and implement them. And I think that Vice Chair Barr's report is an excellent first step in that, but we've got to follow through.
Hi there, Megan Casella with Barron's. Did the possibility of pausing at this meeting come up at all, and how seriously was that considered? I'm curious if you can give us any color as to whether there were any initial concerns about raising rates again, or what those discussions entailed.
So support for the 25 basis point rate increase was very strong across the board. I would say there are a number of people, and you'll see this in the minutes. I don't want to try to do the head count in real time, but people did talk about pausing, but not so much at this meeting. There's a sense that we're much closer to the end of this than to the beginning. That as I mentioned, if you add up all the tightening that's going on through various channels, we feel like we're getting close, or maybe even there. But that's going to be an ongoing assessment, and we're going to be looking at those factors that we listed and to determine whether there's more to do.
I'm curious too how to interpret that and the changes to the statement. Is the bar higher now to raise rates at the next meeting, or would a strong jobs report or inflation print be enough to push the Fed to tighten again?
I don't want to. I couldn't really say. I just think I think we've moved a long way fairly quickly, and I think we can afford to look at the data and make a careful assessment.
Hi, Chair Powell. Nancy Marshall-Genzer with Marketplace. You mentioned a few times about the lessons you learned from the banking crisis, that you would learn the right lessons. What are those lessons?
Well, I just would start with something that's changed, really, which is the run on Silicon Valley Bank was out of keeping with the speed of runs through history. And that now needs to be reflected in some way in regulation and in supervision. We know now that we know it's possible. I think we didn't. No one thought that was possible. No one had. I'm not aware of anybody thinking that this could happen quite so quickly. So I think that that will play through. It will be up to Vice Chair Barr to really take the lead in designing the ways to address that. But I think that's one thing. I guess I would just say that then we're gonna revisit. It's pretty clear we need, to me anyway, it's clear that we need to strengthen both supervision and regulations for banks of this size, and I'm thinking that we're on track to do that as well.
Can you be any more specific on stress testing or looking at banks that have specific concentrations in certain parts of the economy?
Yeah, that's what Vice Chair Barr's role really is, and he'll take the lead on that. Thank you.
일단은 잠깐만. I need to check. Display. Not bad for the first trial. Well, basically, as the video talks a lot, the speed of the translation cannot really follow the speed of the video. But it's still okay because it's catch up well and looks okay. Good test. Thank you. Bye.